The sheriff's knock didn't sound like knocking. It sounded like ownership. Final. Cold. Already decided. At exactly 12:03 p.m., he stood on my porch holding papers with my name on them, papers saying I had 10 days to leave the only home I thought was mine. Behind him, my mother stood on the sidewalk, arms folded like she was watching someone else's problem. My father didn't meet my eyes, and beside them was my younger brother, Tyler, gripping a set of keys that used to belong to me. They hadn't warned me. They hadn't even told me they'd sold the house. I'd spent 8 years paying the mortgage, 8 years covering their missed payments after my father's injury, 8 years believing their promise. This house will always be yours. But they hadn't just taken the house. They had taken my stability, my trust, and the future I thought I was building. What they didn't know was that I had signed one document 5 years earlier. The sheriff didn't apologize for ruining my life at noon on a Tuesday. He stood on my porch like he belonged there, boots planted firmly against the welcome mat I had bought 3 years ago. "Miss Whitaker?" he asked, already knowing the answer. I nodded slowly, my fingers still gripping the edge of the door, feeling the wood grain beneath my skin. He handed me the envelope. Behind him, my mother stood at the curb, her lips pressed into a thin line that spoke of 1,000 unspoken justifications. My father stared at the ground as if the pavement held the answers he couldn't give me. And Tyler, my younger brother, stood beside them holding a key ring. My key ring. The silver one with the tiny house charm I bought when I moved in. "This is a court-authorized eviction notice," the sheriff said, his voice flat and procedural. "You have 10 days to vacate." My ears rang with a deafening, high-pitched silence. The worst part wasn't the paper, or the cold legal language printed in bold black ink. It was Tyler stepping forward and unlocking the front gate like it already belonged to him, his movements casual and practiced. He didn't look at the flower beds I had planted, or the fence I had stained myself. "I'll be moving in next month," he said quietly, his voice devoid of any brotherly affection. My throat tightened until it felt like I was swallowing glass. "Moving in," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. He just looked past me into the hallway. My father finally spoke from the sidewalk, his voice strained and distant. "It's complicated, Natalie. We had to make a choice for the family." No, it wasn't complicated at all. They had chosen him. They had chosen his comfort over my survival. And they had done it in the dark, behind my back, while I was still paying their bills. My name is Natalie Whitaker. I was 32 years old, a senior financial compliance analyst at a regional healthcare company. I lived carefully, tracked every cent, and built my life deliberately so I would never be caught off guard. 8 years ago, I saved my parents from losing their home when the world felt like it was ending for them. After my father's back injury, they fell behind on the mortgage payments. They were weeks from foreclosure, facing the street. I stepped in without hesitation. I drained my savings account. I made the payments every month. I kept the house alive when it was breathing its last breath. I did it because they looked me in the eye and made a sacred promise. "This will always be your home, Natalie," they said. They had looked me in the eye when they said it, and I had believed them. They had lied to me for nearly a decade. I sat at my kitchen table after the sheriff and my family left, staring at the eviction notice as the afternoon sun moved across the floor. Then I opened my laptop. My hands didn't shake. They moved with a cold, terrifying purpose. I opened a folder labeled Property Legal. Inside was a scanned document dated 5 years earlier. It was a quitclaim deed, signed, notarized, filed with the county. Their signatures were right there, transferring partial ownership to me. They had needed my financial help to refinance the high-interest loan they'd taken out. They had needed my steady income and high credit score to qualify for the better rates. In exchange for my signature on the loan, they had given me a legal stake in the property. They must have forgotten about that day at the bank. They had moved on, assuming I was just a tenant. I hadn't forgotten. I leaned back slowly in my chair. I didn't call them to scream. I didn't argue or throw a tantrum on the front lawn for the neighbors to see. I didn't even show them the document yet. I needed to understand one thing first, the absolute truth of why they did this. Not the excuse they would tell the relatives, but the real reason. The truth came faster than I expected, delivered through the glowing screen of my phone. 3 days after the sheriff showed up, Tyler posted a photo on social media. He was standing in front of my house, grinning like a lottery winner. The caption read, "New beginnings. Finally got the keys to my forever home." The comments were full of congratulations from people who didn't know the cost of that house. My mother replied, "You deserve this, Tyler. We're so proud of you." My hands went still. Deserve. After everything I had done, I realized this wasn't about survival. I drove to their rental house the next morning, my mind a sharp, clear blade. My mother opened the door, her face already hardening into a defensive mask before I could speak. "You should have called first, Natalie," she said, blocking the doorway. I held her gaze, refusing to look away. "Why didn't you tell me you were selling the house I live in?" I asked. She sighed heavily, looking at me like I was an exhausting child. "Tyler needs stability, Natalie. He's had a hard run." "And I didn't need stability," I countered. She didn't answer. She just looked at her manicured nails. My father spoke from the living room, his voice echoing. "He's starting a family, Natalie. He needs the space more than a single woman does." I nodded slowly as the reality set in. So that made me expendable. My years of sacrifice were just a down payment for my brother's unearned future. On my way out of their house, I paused in the small entryway to tie my shoe. They thought I had already walked through the front gate. "She'll land on her feet," my mother said to my father, her voice sounding light and unburdened. "She always does. Natalie is a strong one." My father replied, "You're right. She doesn't need the help like Tyler does. He would fall apart without this." I stood frozen, my hand on the doorknob. They weren't worried about hurting me or making me homeless. They were actually counting on my strength to absorb their betrayal, so they wouldn't have to feel guilty. They used my resilience as a reason to mistreat me. That was the exact moment I stopped protecting them in my heart. I realized that being the strong one was just a role they assigned me, so they could be selfish. I walked to my car in silence. Days passed, and the 10-day clock on the eviction notice kept ticking toward zero. I packed nothing. I didn't buy boxes or rent a truck. I simply waited. I knew the law better than they did, especially since I worked in financial compliance. Legally, the eviction and any potential sale required the consent of all owners on the title. And they didn't have that consent. Not without me. But they didn't know that yet because they had treated me like a daughter instead of a business partner for too long. I wanted them to discover the wall I had built themselves. I wanted them to feel the moment their plan hit the hard reality of the law. I spent my evenings reviewing the county statutes and preparing my defense. I was a partial owner of that dirt and those walls. On day 7, the first crack in their perfect plan finally appeared on my doorstep. Tyler showed up unannounced on Thursday evening, looking far less confident than he did in his social media photos. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from side to side on the porch. "The title company found something," he said, his voice reaching a higher pitch. I didn't react. I just leaned against the doorframe and waited. "Your name is showing up on the deed," he continued, looking at me with a mix of confusion and budding anger. I nodded slowly, enjoying the cool evening air. "Yes, it is," I said. His face tightened, his jaw set in a stubborn line. "You need to sign it over to us immediately, Natalie. The buyers are getting impatient, and the closing is supposed to be on Friday." Need. Not ask. Not request. Not apologize for trying to throw me out. He just expected me to hand him my life's work. I smiled faintly at him. "No," I said. His voice sharpened into a snarl. "This is my house, Natalie. Mom and Dad promised it to me." I looked at the house I had maintained, the roof I had replaced, and the taxes I had paid. "No," I said calmly, my voice dropping an octave. "It's ours. Legally, I own a significant portion of his property. And I am not signing anything." He stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. He was used to the Natalie who fixed everyone's problems and stayed quiet in the background. He was looking for the sister who would set herself on fire to keep the family warm. She wasn't there anymore. I shut the door and locked it, listening to him shout my name from the porch. Good. Let him shout, because I was done being the version of myself they relied on. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea. Their panic was immediate and loud. My phone rang that night, vibrating against the wooden table. It was my father. His voice was strained and lacked its usual booming authority. "Natalie, why didn't you tell us you were still on the deed?" he asked. I kept my tone even and professional, the same way I spoke to auditors at work. "You didn't tell me you sold my home behind my back, Dad. I figured we were both keeping secrets." Silence stretched across the line, heavy and awkward. For once in his life, he had no defense, no lecture, and no moral high ground to stand on. He had tried to steal from his daughter, and he had been caught by a piece of paper he'd signed years ago. "We need you to sign the release," he pleaded. "The money is already tied up." I didn't ask what he meant by tied up. I already knew the answer. I did some digging through our shared family bank records that I still had access to. I learned they had already spent a large portion of the sale money before the deal even closed. They had taken an advance or used their own savings, thinking the house sale was a sure thing. They had spent it helping Tyler with his massive gambling debts and maxed out credit cards. They had paid off medical bills and bought him a new car to start his new life. They had bet everything on my silence and my predictable compliance. They had never imagined that I would offer any form of resistance. They viewed me as a resource, not a person with my own needs and rights. They had spent my equity before it was even in their hands, and now the bank was asking questions they couldn't answer. They were drowning, and they expected me to dive in. I didn't threaten them with a lawsuit or call the police. I simply made one clear, firm offer. I sent a formal email to my parents and Tyler. I told them I would sign the deed over, but only if they bought out my share at fair market value. Nothing more, nothing less. I included a professional appraisal I had commissioned months ago when I first suspected they were being shady. My father called it unreasonable within minutes of the email being sent. My mother called me selfish and cold-hearted in a long, rambling text message. I didn't argue with them. I just called it justice. I told them that my 8 years of mortgage payments weren't a gift. They were an investment in my future. I was done giving away my life for people who wouldn't even give me a phone call before selling the roof over my head. Then the external pressure started. Relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years began calling and texting. An aunt called to tell me I needed to do the right thing for the family and stop being so greedy. A cousin I barely liked said I was tearing the family apart over a few dollars. I listened to all of them with a strange, detached curiosity. It was fascinating to see how they all lined up behind the people who had actually committed the betrayal. They didn't care about the facts, they cared about the status quo. I realized they just wanted me to be quiet, so they didn't have to deal with the drama. I listened to their guilt trips until they ran out of breath. Then I hung up without saying a word. They hadn't been there when I was working overtime to cover the bills. They didn't get to dictate my release. Tyler came to the house one last time, his mask of brotherly love completely gone. He was angry, his face red and his eyes narrowed. "You're ruining everything, Natalie. My wife is pregnant, and we have nowhere else to go." I met his eyes through the screen door, feeling nothing but a dull pity. "No, Tyler," I said. "You ruined everything when you agreed to take a house you knew I was paying for. You did this when you took what wasn't yours." He scoffed and kicked a decorative pot on the porch. "It was never yours. You're just a daughter. It's the son's job to carry the family name." I didn't even bother to respond to that outdated nonsense. I just watched him stomp back to his car. I knew something he didn't. The law didn't care about family names or gender. The law only cared about the signatures on the deed. The legal reality finally hit them like a freight train. Their original buyer backed out of the deal because the title was clouded. Without my signature, my parents couldn't sell the property to anyone. And without selling the house, they couldn't recover the money they had already spent on Tyler's debts. They were trapped by their own decision, caught in a financial vice of their own making. The title company refused to move forward, and the bank was starting to look into the advance they had received under false pretenses. They had tried to bypass the rules, and now the rules were holding them under. My mother called me, her voice finally breaking into real sobs. "We didn't mean for it to happen like this, Natalie. We just wanted Tyler to have a chance." But she never said she was sorry for hurting me. She was only sorry for failing. I stayed in the house, the 10-day eviction notice now a useless piece of paper. My mother called again, her voice smaller this time. "Natalie, please. We are going to lose everything if you don't sign." I knew she was right, but it wasn't my responsibility to save them from their own greed anymore. She spent 20 minutes explaining how they were just trying to be fair to Tyler because I was so successful. She still didn't get it. Fairness isn't taking from one child to give to another. That's just theft wrapped in a bow. She was sorry the plan didn't work. She was sorry she got caught. But she wasn't sorry for the 12:03 p.m. knock on my door. I told her I would consider her plea and hung up. I needed to think about my next move very carefully. I wasn't the strong one anymore. I was the owner. Then came the twist they never saw coming. I received a phone call from the man who had been their original buyer. He was a local real estate developer, and he had done his own research into the property's history. He saw that I was a partial owner and a financial professional. He realized that my parents were the problem, not me. He called me directly and made me an offer. It was higher than the original sale price they had agreed on, much higher. He wanted to turn the land into a small luxury duplex. He didn't need my parents' approval if I could convince them to sell their remaining shares to him. He offered to handle the legal fees to clear the title. For the first time in this entire nightmare, I held complete and total control over the situation. I held their financial lives in the palm of my hand. My father called again on Monday morning. "What do you want, Natalie?" he asked, his voice flat and defeated. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't ask if I was okay after being threatened with homelessness. He didn't ask how my work was going or if I needed anything. He just wanted the terms of his surrender. I gave them the same answer I had given from the start. I wanted the fair market value for my share of the house, plus reimbursement for the extra taxes I had paid over the years. They couldn't afford it because they had already given the money to Tyler. They were backed into a corner with no exit. I told them about the developer's offer. I told them that if they agreed to his terms, they might walk away with a small profit. If they didn't, I would sue for a partition sale and they would get even less. Tyler's life started to collapse under the weight of the reality he couldn't avoid. He stopped calling me to scream. He stopped posting his arrogant photos on social media. He stopped pretending he was the king of the castle. Because his entire future had depended on a gift he never earned and a betrayal he didn't have the stomach to finish. He realized that the strong sister he had mocked was the only thing standing between him and total financial ruin. My parents were forced to tell him the truth. The house wasn't his, and it never would be. He had to move back into their small rental apartment with his pregnant wife. It was a tight, miserable fit. I felt a small twinge of sadness for the wife, but I remember the keys in Tyler's hand on that first day. He had been so ready to take my home. I finally made the decision to move forward with the developer. I accepted his offer on my share of the house. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of closure. The process was long and required a lot of paperwork, but I handled it all with the precision I used at my job. The house sold. It was done legally, cleanly, and properly this time. My portion of the proceeds was transferred to my account, a sum that finally compensated me for the years of stability and financial support I had provided to my family. For the first time in my adult life, I was actually being paid for my value instead of being used for my kindness. I watched the final documents get stamped at the title company. My parents signed their shares over too, their faces grim and silent. They were finally facing the truth. The consequences for my parents and Tyler were severe. They couldn't recover financially from the loss of the advance money they had already spent. Their credit scores were ruined, and their reputation in the family was tarnished once the full truth came out. Their assumptions that I would just take it had cost them everything they valued. It wasn't because I went out of my way to punish them or make their lives miserable. It was because reality has a way of catching up to people who build their lives on lies. They had to move to a much smaller, cheaper apartment in a bad part of town. Tyler had to take a second job delivering pizzas to pay back the debts he still owed. I didn't celebrate their downfall, but I didn't step in to stop it either. They had to learn how to stand on their own. I moved into a quiet, modern condo on the other side of town. It was smaller than the house, but it was peaceful and filled with light. Most importantly, it was mine. Entirely mine. There was no shared ownership, no emotional debt hanging over the balcony, and no silent obligations to people who didn't respect me. I spent my first night there sitting on the floor, eating pizza and listening to the silence. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I didn't miss the big house or the garden I had slaved over. I realized I had been a prisoner in that house, trapped by my own sense of duty to people who didn't deserve it. I was finally free. I looked at the keys on my new counter. They were heavy, solid, and they only belonged to me. I finally understood the truth of my family. They hadn't betrayed me in a single moment on a Tuesday at noon. They had simply revealed who they had always been, and I had finally stopped pretending otherwise. I learned the hard way that not everyone who raises you is meant to protect you. Sometimes, you have to be the one to protect yourself from the people who claim to love you. They gave me one final gift, clarity. They taught me that love without respect is just a set of expectations. And expectation is not the same thing as ownership. I didn't actually lose my home that day the sheriff knocked. I lost an illusion that was holding me back. And in its place, I built something much stronger and more permanent. A life no one could take from me again. Because this time, everything was in my name.